He tore his wife's sleeve open in one hard, furious motion, not out of desire, but because after 3 months of a marriage, neither of them had chosen for love, he needed, finally, to see her tremble. What the lamplight found wasn't tears. It was scars, faint, old, tracing the length of her arm, the kind that come from years survived rather than a single bad night. In that instant, everything Rafael Castellano believed about his dead brother, about this marriage, about the woman standing in front of him, came apart at once. If you're reading this story, please leave a comment with the name of the city you're in. I'd love to know how far this story has progressed. Don't turn off the screen just yet. This is just the beginning. It started hours earlier than that, the way most unravelings do, quietly, without anyone in the room realizing it had already begun. The wind off Lake Michigan hit the glass so hard it seemed to want in. 34 floors above Gold Coast, the penthouse glowed gold and cold at once, all marble and silence, the city spread out below like something owned rather than lived in. Rafael Castellano stood in the center of that silence, a glass of untouched bourbon sweating in his hand. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed, his shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway, his eyes the gray of a Chicago sky before snow. A faded tattoo of rose vines wound along his forearm, visible where he'd rolled his sleeve, the only soft thing about him. He was the Mafia boss who ran this city's underworld from behind glass and good tailoring. And tonight was the night he intended to finally break the woman standing by the window. 3 months earlier, his younger brother Nico had died in a car explosion near the Kennedy Expressway. Rafe had buried him without tears and without answers, and in the wreckage of that grief, he had made a decision that felt, at the time, like justice. He would marry the woman he believed had led Nico astray, and he would make her regret every day she had ever known his family's name. Serafina Quinn was 25, dark-haired, quiet in a way that unsettled people who mistook quiet for weakness. She wore a long-sleeved cream dress that covered her arms to the wrist, every inch of fabric doing the work of hiding something she had carried for 6 long years. She was looking down at the city, not at him, the way she always did, like a woman perpetually counting the exits in a room. "Tonight," Rafe said, his voice low and utterly without romance, "you don't get to pretend anymore." He crossed the room in 4 strides and closed his hand around her sleeve. He expected tears. He expected the trembling apology he had spent 3 months waiting for, the confession that would finally let him hate her without complication. He tore the fabric in one hard motion. The sound of ripping cloth cracked through the silent penthouse like a gunshot. What the lamplight found was not tears. It was scars, faint, old, tracing the length of her arm, the kind that come from years survived rather than a single bad night. Rafe's grip loosened before he told it to. Something shifted behind his eyes, the first flicker of doubt he had allowed himself in 3 months. Rafe had built his fury out of something safer than grief. A target was easier to carry than a brother he couldn't save. Beneath the anger was a man terrified that Nico's death was somehow his own failure, and hating Sarah had let him postpone that fear. What he hadn't accounted for was a woman whose stillness came from the same place his rage did. Both of them had learned, long before tonight, that survival means never letting your face show what's actually happening inside you. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't explain. She reached up and pulled the torn fabric back over her shoulder with a motion so practiced it looked like muscle memory. Because it was. When she spoke, her voice was flat, almost gentle, carrying the terrible calm of someone who had survived worse than this more than once before. "You wanted to see me shake," she said. "You already have." The words landed harder than the silence they replaced. Years of pain lived inside that one sentence, and Rafe, a man who had built an empire on reading people before they finished speaking, realized he had no idea who she actually was. Somewhere behind her fear, a question was already forming that would follow him for the rest of his life. Who had done this to her? And why, exactly, had Victor Castellano been so insistent that Rafe marry her? Sarah's hand drifted, almost absently, to the pocket of her dress, where an old, cracked phone sat heavy against her hip. Inside it were messages from Nico, messages Rafe had never seen, never known existed, sent in the final days before his brother's death. Rafe didn't know it yet, but that phone held a second layer of truth his brother had tried, in his last weeks alive, to pass to him through the one person he trusted to keep it safe. The scene closed on Rafe's face in the low gold light, a man who controlled every room he entered, no longer in control of the story he was standing inside of. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your whole story, stay with her. This is only the beginning. 3 months of marriage passed in a silence colder than the Chicago winter outside. Rafe ran his empire by day and watched his wife by night, the way a man watches something he no longer trusts himself to understand. Every Mafia boss learns to read a room before he learns to trust one, and Sarah had become the one room he couldn't read at all. Sarah kept her rituals: black coffee at 6 each morning, a worn paperback she never finished, a wide berth around his study as though the room itself might bite. Her composure, her refusal to break, only deepened his suspicion. Victims cried, victims begged. She did neither. Then, one night past midnight, she came to him. It was the first time in 3 months she had entered his study on her own. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and mentioned, casually, precisely, the East Conference Room, the private meeting space where Victor Castellano had for years held gatherings that only the family's inner circle was permitted to know about. Rafe went still. She knew things about his family's architecture of power that outsiders never learned. The balance in the room tilted, quietly, dangerously. The woman he had dismissed as a victim was holding information he didn't have. He went back through Nico's old case files that same night and found what he had somehow missed: a string of encrypted messages Nico had sent to Sarah in the weeks before his death. She had tried, indirectly, to warn him about Victor. She had not been a passive casualty of his family's cruelty. She had been preparing, watching, trying to save him before he even understood there was danger to be saved from. Rafe sat alone in the dark that night, with a glass of bourbon gone warm in his hand, rereading his dead brother's words, and for the first time he let himself consider that Nico's pain had never been about a woman who ruined him. It had been about something else entirely. 2 days later, a file from his private investigator confirmed it. The marriage had never been Rafe's idea, not really. It had been Victor's design from the start, a trap built from Rafe's grief and aimed with surgical precision at Sarah, the daughter of a judge who had once tried to dismantle the very trafficking network Victor had spent decades protecting. That night, Sarah reached into her purse and drew out a small USB drive she had kept hidden for months. Inside was an audio recording, Victor's own voice confessing to the murder of Rafe's father. Nico had recorded it before he died and had entrusted it to her, waiting for the moment she could trust the right person with it. She had been carrying the truth the entire time. Rafe hadn't been protecting her, she had been protecting him, and now he needed her far more than she had ever needed him. His voice came out rough when he finally spoke. "Why didn't you give this to me sooner?" "Because you weren't ready to believe me," she said. The words cut cleaner than anything Victor had ever done to him. Rafe called federal agent Lena Vargas that same night, his voice tight with urgency. Before he could finish making arrangements, his phone buzzed. A message from Nico's old number, sent 3 years earlier, never opened. He stared at the screen and didn't dare open it. Whatever Nico had wanted him to see, some part of him already sensed it would matter more than anything on that USB drive. What could a message from a dead man possibly still be waiting to say? Keep listening. The answer changes everything. But not yet. Sarah had proof that could have cleared everything up the very first week of this marriage, and she sat on it for months until she trusted him enough to hand it over. Smart survival or unforgivable silence? Team Sarah or Team Rafe? Drop your one-word verdict in the comments before you keep watching. Rafe and Sarah met Agent Lena Vargas at a safe house in Lincoln Park before dawn. Vargas was 48, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, the kind of federal agent who had long since stopped being surprised by what powerful men were capable of. They handed over everything, the USB, the encrypted messages, the fragments of a story that had taken 3 months and one torn sleeve to come together. Vargas opened a file on the table, and the room went quiet in a different way. Rafe's father had not died of natural causes, as the family had always claimed. Victor had murdered him because in his final years, his father had grown desperate to bury a network he'd once helped build, one that had since spiraled far past anything he'd intended. This wasn't only a betrayal by blood. It was the collapse of a memory Rafe had spent his entire life standing on. Rafe sat without moving for a long time after he finished reading. His hands lay flat against the table, his eyes gone dark and distant. For the first time since Sarah had known him, he let his composure fall away entirely in front of her. Every choice Rafe had made since Nico's death, the marriage, the cruelty, the control, had been built on the unshakable belief that his father was the one clean thing in his bloodline. Losing that certainty didn't just cost him a parent, it cost him the story he told himself about who he was allowed to become. Underneath his stillness was a man terrified that if his father could hide something this large, then perhaps he himself was capable of becoming exactly the kind of man he'd sworn never to be. A fear that would quietly steer every decision he made from this point forward. Vargas pressed play on the recording. Victor's voice filled the small room, cold and matter-of-fact, confessing to a murder he had never once lost sleep over. Vargas noted, for the record, that the confession corroborated financial transfers her office had already traced back through Victor's accounts. The recording wasn't standing alone. It was the final piece locking a case they'd been quietly building for months. Rafe rose and walked to the window, staring out at Lincoln Park buried under fresh snow. "It was Victor," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever my father started, Victor is the one who buried him for trying to end it." Sarah watched him with the look of a woman who had waited a long time for this exact moment. "You almost handed me over," she said quietly, "to the very man who's hunted me for 6 years. The words landed like a verdict. Rafe understood all at once that he had never been the predator in this story. He had been a tool, used by his own uncle to deliver Sarah straight into the hands of the man who had spent years trying to erase her. The balance of the entire story shifted in that silence. Sarah's phone buzzed instead this time, a short message from an unknown number, 3 words only. "He knows more." She didn't recognize it, but something in her stomach went cold. Whoever had sent it knew exactly where they were. Someone out there knows more than either of them do. Keep watching. The next betrayal is already walking toward them. Snow kept falling outside the safe house windows as Vargas's team processed the new evidence. The heater ticked somewhere behind the wall, an old radiator fighting a losing battle against the Chicago cold. And for a while, the only sounds in the room were pages turning and the soft scrape of Vargas's pen against a legal pad. Rafe sat across from Sarah at the small kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them. Neither had spoken in almost 10 minutes. It was Sarah who finally broke it, not with words but with a gesture. She reached over and turned his mug a quarter turn, so the chipped handle faced away from him, toward herself. A small thing. The kind of thing you only do for someone you've decided to keep. "You don't have to fix my coffee," Rafe said, and there was no edge in it, just tiredness.
I know, she said. I wanted to.
He looked at her a beat too long. Outside, the wind pushed a sheet of snow sideways past the window, and somewhere down the hall a radio crackled with a federal agent's voice, low and clipped. Rafe found himself thinking, not for the first time that week, that he had spent 3 months trying to read a woman who had already decided, long before he had, what kind of man he might become if given the chance. "Mark's late," Rafe said finally, glancing at the door. "He's never late." Sarah's eyes flicked up at that, just a flicker, gone as fast as it came. And later, much later, Rafe would remember that flicker and understand it for what it was. She hadn't known what was coming. But some old instinct in her, some 6-year-old habit of counting exits, had already clocked the wrongness of it before he had. The door opened without a knock. Marcus Rivera stood in the frame with a gun raised, and for 1 full second, nobody in the room moved, as though the scene needed permission to become real. 52 years old, thick-necked, built like something carved rather than born, Mark had been Rafe's right hand for 12 years, the first man Rafe had called the night Nico died, the man who had stood beside him at the funeral with a hand on his shoulder while Rafe forgot how to breathe. He still carried the old security clearance codes from his years running Rafe's protection detail, credentials nobody had thought to revoke yet, because officially, no one in the operation knew he'd turned. The overhead light caught the barrel of the gun and threw a thin white line across the ceiling. Rafe's mind, in the strange slow-motion clarity of real danger, snagged on a detail that didn't belong. Mark's hand wasn't shaking. A man drawing a weapon on the person he'd guarded for over a decade should have been shaking. Mark's hand was steady as a surgeon's, and somehow that steadiness was worse than any tremor could have been. "Mark," Rafe started. "Don't," Mark said. His voice cracked on the single syllable, the only crack in him that showed. Chaos broke fast. Rafe lunged, and the 2 men grappled, the table scraping hard against the floor, a lamp toppling and rolling, its cord snapping taut and yanking the plug from the wall so half the room dropped into shadow. A shot cracked into the ceiling, plaster raining down in a fine white dust that caught the remaining light like snow indoors, and for one disorienting heartbeat, Rafe couldn't tell which kind of white was falling, outside or in. Sarah moved before either man had time to reset. She snatched the fallen weapon off the floor and raised it with a steadiness that surprised everyone in the room, her feet already squared, her elbows already locked in a stance that had clearly been drilled into muscle memory years before tonight. Nico had taught her to shoot years ago, in a life none of them had known about, in some quiet field outside the city, where a boy who would later die too young had wanted, at least once, to make sure the people he loved could protect themselves. "Stop," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Mark stopped instantly. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the smell of gunpowder and drywall dust, the radiator still ticking obliviously behind the wall, someone's breath ragged in the dark. Rafe straightened slowly, one hand braced on the overturned table, and looked at the man who had taught him how to hold a gun himself when he was 19 years old and terrified of his own father's world. He didn't resist after that. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone tired, almost relieved to finally say it out loud, the way a man sounds after carrying a stone up a hill for so long that setting it down feels like grief and mercy at once. "I worked for Victor before you ever took over," he told Rafe. "But in 12 years, I stopped him from ordering your death 17 times. I kept you alive the only way I knew how." The room absorbed that in silence. Rafe thought, absurdly, of the summer he'd turned 26, when Mark had pulled him out of a car half a second before it caught fire. An accident, everyone had said at the time. He wondered now how many of those near misses in his life had actually been Mark's hand on the wheel of fate, invisible, unacknowledged, never once mentioned. The man who had betrayed a Mafia boss had also, in his own broken way, been shielding him the entire time. Mark wasn't finished. "I've also been feeding Agent Vargas information for over a year, enough to build the case, enough to build myself an exit." That was the message Sarah had received minutes earlier. Mark, trying one last time to warn them before he walked in the door himself. He had been playing both sides for a long time, protecting himself as carefully as he had protected and betrayed the man across from him. Mark's 12 years of silence weren't cowardice. They were a slower, more exhausting kind of courage, the sort that never gets thanked because no one ever knows what it prevented. He had spent a decade choosing, again and again, between the man who paid him and the man he'd sworn to protect. And tonight was simply the day the math stopped working. What made it unbearable for Rafe wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that loyalty and treachery had been living in the same man, in the same chest, for 12 years, and that he had never once been able to tell them apart. Vargas stepped forward and cuffed Mark herself, her movements clinical, unhurried, the practiced calm of someone who had watched 100 men break in 100 different ways and had stopped being surprised by any of them. She paused before leading him out and looked back at Rafe. "For what it's worth," she said, "his information was good. All of it checked out." Rafe said nothing. There was nothing yet that felt like the right size for what he was feeling. Then Vargas's radio crackled with something worse. Once the marriage became public and the investigation stirred, Victor's people had quietly traced a wire transfer from Frank Harlan's bank account. Proof he'd been sending Sarah money in secret for years. Small deposits under a false company name, sent every month without fail since the week she'd first disappeared from her old life. Frank Harlan wasn't blood. He had been her father's oldest friend on the bench, a retired court clerk who'd watched a judge's daughter vanish into hiding and had quietly decided, without ever being asked, that he would be the one steady thing she could still count on. Victor now knew exactly who had hidden her, and had just ordered a hit on Frank at his home in Bridgeport. The threat had stopped being theoretical and become immediate, a direct strike at the only family Sarah had left. Sarah's face didn't change, but her hand found the edge of the table and gripped it, knuckles going pale. And Rafe understood in that instant that this, not the gun, not Mark, not even Victor's confession, was the moment her composure was actually being tested. "We're not losing him too," she said quietly. It wasn't a request. "We won't," Rafe said, and for the first time all night, he meant it the way a promise is supposed to be meant. Rafe watched Mark get led away in handcuffs and felt something break loose in his chest that had nothing to do with the gunshot still ringing in his ears. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the loss of the one man he thought had never lied to him, only to learn the lie and the loyalty had lived side by side the whole time. Vargas ordered the extraction team out within minutes. Rafe and Sarah stood together in the safe house afterward, saying nothing, the snow falling harder outside, the plaster dust still settling in a fine white film across the overturned table between them, like something that hadn't decided yet whether it was ash or snow. "If Mark had a plan this long in motion," Rafe finally said, almost to himself, "what else does Victor still have left to play?" Frank's life hangs in the balance, and Victor still has one more card no one saw coming. Don't look away now. Frank Harlan was safe by morning, moved into federal protection before Victor's men ever reached him. Sarah heard the confirmation over the phone at 5 a.m. and sat down hard on the edge of the bed, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, breathing like someone surfacing from underwater. Rafe stood in the doorway and didn't touch her, didn't say anything comforting. He had learned, these past days, that Sarah's relief needed room, not rescue. In a small apartment in Lincoln Park, Rafe sat alone in the kitchen a few hours later with a cup of coffee gone cold, sleeves rolled up so the rose vine tattoo showed pale under the kitchen light, staring out at the gray sweep of Lake Michigan through a window fogged faintly at the edges. Snow had stopped falling some time before dawn, and the city outside looked scrubbed clean, the way it always did after a storm, as if nothing underneath it had ever been dirty at all. For the first time since this began, he did not feel like a man in control of anything. He heard her before he saw her, the soft scuff of socked feet on hardwood, a sound he'd come, without quite noticing, to associate with safety rather than surveillance. Sarah came and sat across from him. She placed a small key on the table between them, and the sound of metal against wood seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet kitchen. "Frank keeps a safety deposit box at a bank downtown, under a false name," she said. "The key was hidden in a necklace Nico gave me before he died. I never opened it, not until I trusted you enough to." Rafe turned the key over once with 2 fingers, feeling its small, ordinary weight, and thought of the necklace he'd seen 100 times without ever asking about it. A thin gold chain she wore even to bed, tucked under her collar, that she touched sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it. He'd assumed in his worst months that it was a gift from a lover. He understood now it had been his brother's last piece of foresight, worn against her skin like a held breath for 6 years. "He gave it to you before he died," Rafe said slowly. "Not after Victor started closing in. Before. He knew something was coming." "He always knew more than he let on," Sarah said, and for the first time since Rafe had met her, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth, sad but real. "He used to say, the quietest person in the room is usually the one keeping score." Rafe huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Sounds like someone else I know." She held his gaze a moment longer than she needed to, and outside a delivery truck rumbled past on the wet street below, its tires hissing through slush, an utterly ordinary sound that somehow made the moment feel more real rather than less. Proof that the world outside this kitchen was still turning, indifferent to everything that had just been survived inside it. The strongest piece of evidence in the entire story had never sat with Rafe or with the federal government. It had been carried, quietly, by the person everyone had underestimated from the very first night. What the box revealed, combined with the recordings and Vargas's financial trail, was the darkest layer yet. Victor hadn't only used Rafe to trap Sarah. He had intended, once she was dealt with, to eliminate Rafe too, clearing the last obstacle between himself and total control of the family. Rafe listened to Victor's own recorded voice say it plainly, without remorse. Once the girl was handled, the boy wouldn't be worth keeping around either. The recording had a strange, almost bored calm to it, Victor's tone the same one he'd used at family dinners to discuss real estate, and it was that flatness, more than the words themselves, that made Rafe's stomach turn. Rafe's hand closed into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. For the first time, he understood real fear. Not for his empire, but for his own life. There is a particular kind of fear that only arrives once a man realizes the people who raised him were never protecting him at all, only positioning him. Rafe had spent his whole life believing that loyalty within the family was the one guarantee he could stand on. Hearing his own uncle discuss his death with the same tone he'd used to discuss a property sale didn't just frighten him. It rewrote, retroactively, every birthday, every dinner, every quiet nod of approval Victor had ever given him, turning them all into transactions rather than affection. He wasn't just afraid of dying, he was afraid of realizing how long he'd already been living inside someone else's plan without knowing it. The Mafia boss who once wanted to break her had nothing left to negotiate with. Victor tried to reach him through a lawyer from prison, offering one last compromise, a reduced sentence, a smaller confession, a smaller truth in exchange for Rafe's silence about the rest. Rafe refused before the man could finish the sentence. "There's nothing left to negotiate," he said, and hung up the phone with a steadiness that surprised even him. Sarah watched him with something quieter than pity. "You chose the truth," she said. "That's the first decision you've made for yourself, not for anyone else." He didn't answer right away. He looked instead at the key still sitting on the table between them, and then at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself in 3 months of marriage built on the wrong reasons. "I spent 3 months trying to break you," he said quietly. "And you spent 3 months deciding whether I was even worth saving." "I decided in the first week," Sarah said. "I just needed you to catch up." Before Rafe could call Vargas with an update, his own phone lit up. Not hers this time, his. The old, unopened message from Nico's number was still sitting there, 3 years, untouched. A small red notification he'd walked past 1,000 times, without ever having the courage to open it. Telling himself each time that grief could wait one more day. Something about tonight made him finally open it. It was short. A photo of a ledger page, grainy and slightly tilted, clearly taken in a hurry, and beneath it, one line typed by his brother in the last days of his life. Dad knew. He tried to stop it before they stopped him. Ask Sarah what she knows about the beginning, not just the end. Rafe read it twice, feeling the last piece of ground shift beneath him. The kitchen light hummed faintly overhead. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and cut itself short. Whatever the beginning meant, it was bigger than Victor. One message, 3 years late, just changed everything he thought he understood about his own father. The full truth comes next. The testimony was held on a gray afternoon at the Drake Hotel on Michigan Avenue at a benefit for survivors of human trafficking. The ballroom smelled faintly of white lilies and old brass, chandeliers throwing soft, warm light across rows of folding chairs, arranged with a formality that didn't quite match the weight of what was about to be said in front of them. Sarah walked in wearing a short-sleeved black dress, her scars visible in public for the first time in her life. Her real name, Serafina Vale, was spoken aloud for the first time in 6 years, and the sound of it in the microphone seemed to land on her like a physical thing. She straightened her spine as though bracing for a blow that never came. Rafe sat toward the back, silent, watching, refusing to interfere with what was hers alone to say. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, and more than once he caught himself leaning forward, some old instinct urging him to stand between her and the room. Each time, he made himself stay seated. This was not a moment that needed a Castellano standing guard over it. The evidence went up one piece at a time, the recordings, the messages, the documents from her father, the judge, the file from the safety deposit box. Somewhere in the third row, an older man in a worn gray suit wiped his eyes without shame. Frank Harlan had insisted on being there despite the danger, because, he'd told Sarah quietly the night before, he'd waited 6 years to hear her say her own name out loud in a room that wasn't hiding her. Victor and his entire network were convicted before the week was out. On the screen, his face lost every trace of composure he had spent decades perfecting. And for a moment, watching that unraveling, Rafe felt something he hadn't expected to feel toward the man who'd destroyed his family twice over. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of exhausted relief, the feeling of finally setting down something heavy he hadn't realized he'd been carrying with both hands. Then came the piece Nico's message had pointed toward, the one detail buried deepest in the safety deposit box, the one even Victor hadn't known survived. Decades ago, it had been Rafe's father who first built the network, back when the Castellano name was still climbing toward power, when ambition and survival had looked, in that particular era of the city, indistinguishable from each other. But in his final years, haunted by what he'd created, he had quietly begun dismantling it piece by piece, funneling money to survivors, feeding tips to the very judge who was Sarah's father, working in a silence so complete that even his own sons had never suspected it. Victor had killed him not to protect the family from outside threats, but to protect the empire from the one man trying to end it from within. Rafe's whole adult life had been built on outrunning his father's shadow, first by trying to be the son who made him proud, then by nearly becoming the man Victor had wanted all along. What he faced now wasn't just his father's guilt, it was a mirror. The same silence, the same instinct to protect the family name at any cost, had almost cost him Sarah, too. Choosing to speak the truth publicly wasn't really about clearing his father's name. It was Rafe finally refusing to let concealment be the family's only inheritance. He stood in the middle of the testimony, his voice rough into the microphone, the ballroom so quiet he could hear the faint hiss of the sound system before he spoke. "I'm admitting it," he said. "My father built what my uncle expanded, and today I'm handing over everything, the assets, the accounts, the entire structure, to the federal government." The room went silent. Cameras flashed. Somewhere near the front, Agent Vargas gave the smallest possible nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between two people who both know exactly what a decision like that costs. The Mafia boss once feared across Chicago had just chosen to finish what his father started and never got the chance to. Sarah looked at him from the witness stand, and for the first time there was no wariness left in her eyes. She wasn't standing beside him as someone he had rescued. She was standing beside him as his equal, because she had chosen to. Afterward, in the quiet hallway outside the ballroom, Frank found her before she reached the door. He didn't say much, just took both her hands in his eyes wet, and told her, in a voice that cracked halfway through, that her father would have been proud of the woman standing in front of him. Sarah didn't cry, not there, not yet, but something in her shoulders finally, visibly, let go. They walked out onto Michigan Avenue together afterward, snow falling soft over the city, the noise of the benefit fading behind them into the ordinary hum of traffic and wind. Rafe looked at her, something unguarded in his face for maybe the first time in his life. "You don't have to be here," he said. "Neither do you," she answered. "But we both are." This story reminds us that being underestimated is not the same as being small, and that quiet strength often outlasts anyone who mistakes silence for surrender. If you're sitting with a truth you've never told anyone, write it down tonight, even if it's just in a notebook by the coffee pot, because getting it out of your chest and onto paper changes what it weighs. If there's someone you've been keeping at arm's length out of old hurt, consider calling them this week. Not to fix everything, but just to hear their voice again. And if you've spent years protecting someone else's secret at the cost of your own peace, ask yourself honestly who that silence is really serving. Healing rarely arrives as a single grand moment. It shows up in the small, deliberate choices we make afterward. The phone call we finally make, the truth we finally say out loud, the seat we choose to take at our own table. Serafina didn't wait to be saved. She waited to be believed. That's a decision any of us can make, starting today. What did you think of Sarah's transformation? From the woman everyone underestimated to the one who stood as his equal? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and hard-won justice.